And good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Right.
Yeah, and Bill, great to have you joining in from upper Minnesota or North Dakota.
No, no, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
trying to
not
find
Minnesota.
trying to find my mute button. I'm using an iPad and I'll struggle. Don't worry about
Okay,
me. Go for it. Thank
okay,
you.
all righty. All righty. Well, we're in of course, the midst of our study, of which you are 100% aware of. And let's dive in. We're looking in chapter 13, and I got to do the presentation. We're in chapter 13, of course, and it is really the beginning of the Passion Week. Jesus is with his disciples, and he is just completing the washing of the feet, of which you guys are aware of. Last week, as it says here, we examined using Peter as our example. Remember, Jesus came to Peter and said, "No, you're not going to wash my feet." The resistance, and then he turns the whole thing through Jesus's after Jesus's response. He says, "Well, if you're going to wash my feet, wash my whole body." So, and we looked at that example through Peter as depicting our natural and commonly shared, and I've got that term underlined, greatly hindered ability to receive. From my perspective, that is hugely connected to the natural human condition. I think that we humans naturally are it's very difficult for us to receive. Thus, that kicks off all kinds of ill-placed and destructive behavior. So that's from my mind. And I look at that example with the washing of the feet from that perspective. After we looked at Peter's example, we discussed aspects of the idea that I was proposing and in regard to our own experiences. Here's the text for today. After the foot washing, when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table once again, Jesus said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, for so I am. So, if I, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example so that you also would do just as I did for you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." So let's dive into that text. Whoop, I got a comment. After completion of his service act, Jesus retakes his place. Oh, I'm setting the scene here. Jesus retakes his place among his disciples. He then invites a group participation to discuss, or at least ponder, what just occurred. So that's the context. Picture the upper room. This has occurred. Jesus quietly takes his place, and then he pops this question. And so let's take a look. Now we'll take a look. So 13:12a, I've got the underlined portion first. I split up 12 into two comments. Actually, I have a series of points that we'll be looking at. So here is the first movement within our look. When he had washed their feet, when he was done, and taken up his garment and reclined at the table again. So I just want to pause there at that point before we go into his question. There's little doubt that at the conclusion of the last set of feet, all eyes are on Jesus. Okay, that's my assumption. I'm interested to hear how The Chosen will depict this when they do that. That should be pretty moving. He says nothing yet at this point, but he's acting. But everyone is watching. What is he doing? With all eyes riveted on Jesus, he puts on his outer garment, then takes his place at the table. He sits back down at his empty position. Okay, that's I think that's really good for us to kind of picture what that would look like. His action, no words, is intended to draw the disciples inward toward the meaning in this moment. Everything is about what just occurred. What his action represents is what I coined the term intention, his motivation, his inner drive, his inner motivation. He chose at this moment to lay down his staff, or his stuff rather, represented by his staff, stop doing his stuff in order to provide for those around him. When complete, he simply reassumed the position of where he was prior to his chosen act. It's relatively simple, fellas, what he's done. I think we can all follow his sequence of action, but I think it's pretty profoundly informative if we think about it. In so doing, Jesus demonstrates what service looks like. There is first an intention, a motivation. There is then a removal. We talked, I think 2 weeks ago, about this idea of removing the outer garment representative. I've got to get myself and my own motivations out of the way. and then we called that a full stop. He stops before he does anything. Only now the act of service follows after the full stop. The act is then followed by a reassuming of our prior place among. And I've got one last comment. This is it. This is really it. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think it's we humans that attach other things to this simple but not simplistic example. He said to them, now is when he goes to the question, after he sits down, do you know what I've done for you? Okay, let's look at that. Number 2, only after returning, I call it returning among. He's returning among his own. He asks the question, do you know what I've done for you? His choice of language reveals that his act of service is meant for the benefit of the receiver. The washing was meant to be for. I like that word for, and we're going to see it another time. His washing was for them, their exclusive benefit. There is no other Jesus agenda outside of benefit for the other. 100% purity of motivation, entirely for them, their exclusive benefit. He has done something for them. The only way this can occur is if the intention is motivated free from self-need to benefit. See, my point is that as we are on this journey, we get these two confused. We get the idea of service confused with self-benefit. And Jesus has demonstrated the pure aspect of what service really is at the core. and here's my point. If I do something for another person because of a self need to gain in some way, I miss the point entirely. On the other hand, if I do because of the realization that I am loved regardless, there is, from my perspective, the motivation of which we can grow into, to work out of, an understanding, a realization that I personally and you personally am loved by God through Christ regardless. And as we learn, as we come to understand that and embrace that, it frees us from ourselves to act truly for the benefit of another. Now, here's a bunny trail. I call it a side note, but it's really a bunny trail. So bear with me. So as we ponder this idea of service and motivation in service, we may ask the question, which comes first, giving or receiving? Here's the idea. I'm proposing the idea that you and I need to learn how to receive, which is very difficult for us humans, before we can give free from self. And so others, especially like within the church context, the idea is that we get people into the church and we get them serving quickly. And there is certainly benefit to that. So the question is, how do we think about this? How do we think about this idea of service, especially if we're in a position to direct others' activities in regard to their volunteer work? From my perspective, and I'll state it, one must learn to receive what that is before one can give entirely free from self-need to gain. I think receiving comes first, generally. I'll do it not so fast here in a minute. This sequence has been, now I'm going to support my belief. I think this is representative of who God is throughout all of history. God has and is currently initiating benefit towards us, nothing more, nothing less. Therefore, I believe in a God. My perception of God, because it has everything to do with how we view God, is that God has always been for us. There's that word. I think Jesus, in a micro sense, demonstrates that here in John 13, but it's representative of what God is and has always been like. God is one who is for us. However, this is a mouthful statement. I'm stating what I think at this stage in life, but saying that very statement, it raises all types of questions in regard to what the recorded text says about God. We see God in some places quite erratic. We see a God who's so torqued off at the people of Israel that Moses has to stand in his way and calm him down. And to make this statement is problematic in relation to what we see as the recorded elements of God. So, so it's not that we shouldn't think about it. It's just, how do we think about this? However, giving thought to this subject, I think, is really worth our time. And it really boils down. Just a minute, Dave, and I'll have you comment. It really goes back to how we view God. So anyway, Dave, your comment.
Well, I was taught, if you will, long ago that one of the basic elements of grace is being able to receive.
Oh, yeah. And I don't want to cut you off. Do you want to say some more about that?
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, that is absolutely huge. I think I was taught that too. I mean, grace is everything. But I can honestly say it's taken me 60 years. I'm now 69, and not until I was in my 60s did I really come to a different understanding what that really means for me, and how it's reflective of who God is. I don't know. I don't want to say people don't get it right from the get-go, but my observation is as we get older, the learning how to receive grace is part of it. I don't know, Dave, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think it's linked to pride. Sometimes when and of course, there are degrees or intensities of things that people are doing for us or giving us or whatever. And I think it particularly bears out when one is really in a time of situation of need, whatever that might be. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's emotional, maybe whatever. And sometimes pride is the barrier that raises itself up and says, no, I don't need that. I can do this myself, or, whatever it might be. And that's kind of the antithesis of grace. Part of grace to me is being able to recognize the genuine motivation of other people to help and aid, and to be able to freely accept that, because those people are coming, as Jesus did, they're coming from the heart. They're coming from a lesson of doing something for me because it's the right thing to do. And
Yeah.
I need to be in a place where I can recognize that for what it really is.
And that well said. And for me, that has taken a while, Dave. That just has.
Oh, it can be a sticky wicket, that's for sure.
Yeah. It's really, yeah. So,
Mike, I was wondering what your
Yes.
comment is on the statement, and I'm trying to remember where I first heard it, but it's better to give than to receive.
yeah, I hadn't thought that. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. My thought went to, just a minute, Jeff. I want to state my thought. I did come to a biblical example of Jesus. You have been freely. Oh God, what is it? Freely.
I've got that, Matt.
I'm thinking of the antithesis of that. But Jeff,
Yeah, I was just
following
looking.
it up. What are your thoughts?
Matthew 10:8 says, when Jesus sent out the 12, said, go, let's see, as you go, proclaim this message, the kingdom of heaven has come near, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, freely you have received, freely give.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
My thought is, for me, I tend toward judgment, and I hate that about myself, but I tend to look at others' lives, judge how they're living, and sit in the place of God in that way. So daily I have to receive, I have to remember how much grace I have been given in order to give grace to others. So that freely receiving is what allows you to freely give. It allows you, like on your last slide where it said, you can't do it out of a selfish motivation or you miss the blessing. So if you can turn that around and say, I have received so much grace that I need to offer that to others with, for their benefit, not for my own. I've already received the benefit of grace. Now I can offer it to others.
Yeah, that's where I'm leaning, Jeff. That's where I'm going. Now there's a caveat to that we'll look at, but that's kind of where you said it very good.
Well, and getting back to what Tatsi was saying about better to give than to receive, the thought occurred to me that if all I do is receive the grace and don't offer it to others, if I receive a gift and don't use that for the benefit of others, then I've kind of missed out on the gift myself. So the better part of that gift is now being able to give it to others.
Yeah.
So that's where the better to give comes in for me.
Yeah. I have often, thank you, Jeff, and another well said comment. I have often said to people, like in my classes and so forth, that I've landed at a place in my journey where I think that we learn to understand who we really are, who God has made us, as we give ourselves away.
Mhm.
I do think that. But before we do that, the cart before the horse, we got to learn to receive. And that for me has also been a journey. So this is not an easy thing to resolve, and I'm not attempting to resolve it, but I think it's really healthy to think about. It's my belief that we humans create the conditional expectations. Okay, here's my extrapolation of this idea. God has always been for us, period. I think conditions come from human beings. Thus, we, in our way, the way we cast this, because of our need for conditions, God is for us, and then we define whatever those conditions are, of which we fit. Have any of you read, I know you have, because you talked about this one day, and I got this book and I'm reading Philip Yancey's Where the Light Fell. And boy, he is an amazing, wonderful writer. He is so engaging. And I'm reading the story about his mother right now. And it's amazing anybody makes it. My goodness, she fits this to the T, that she was this very upright religious Bible teacher that was absolutely hell to live with. And she had this belief system that she developed in her head that she hadn't sinned in 3 years. But yet she was a terror to live with these kids. And I'll tell you what, the next emerging generation, they look at a person like that and they go, what zoo are you from? It just doesn't compute. And this is where religious conditions have just gone way south. So anyway, I get so engaged, I get disturbed through how he's writing. He's amazing book. God for us, period, does not naturally work for us humans. We are the ones who need the condition. Now, guys, this is me from my perspective. This is what I think. And there is so much debate. Is it conditional or is it unconditional? Or is it a hybrid of some sort? I think that's worth. But anyway, that's where I'm at this point. So because of this natural conditional thinking, we well-meaning Christian people impose giving onto others who have not yet fully understood receive. I think that's true. Now, hold on, I'm not done yet. This course of action perpetuates burnout, fueled by guilt-ridden bondage, It's driven by our universal need for condition. This would explain young people coming into the faith and being hounded on by the superiors to act and perform a certain way that's reflective of Jesus. And then 20 years later, you find them in an entirely different frame of mind because of the hurt that they have experienced with, quote, the church. The Western world is filled with people like this. But this is only one side. However, here's, again, I'm thinking about this, so I want to be fair. It's also true, I believe this, that it's good for the soul to serve other people regardless of one's current understanding. I also believe we can't wait to invite people into a service opportunity until they come to a full understanding of how much they've received, or we wouldn't have anything going on. It would take 60 years. You'd have to wait to a person, and they wouldn't really learn about grace, and if we waited. So that whole first section, it has holes in it. But and on the other side, there is value in putting people in a place. I think Dave said it's a sticky subject earlier. Service to others has a built-in ability to focus our attention on another. And that's, guys, I think that's very good. Thus, the example of the short-term mission opportunity where we take people from a Western culture and we dump them into a developing world condition where we see people living in just above a grass hut kind of thing, and their biggest intention all day is to just get the day's food. That is a far removed reality, and there is tremendous value in that for people who experience that, to see how most of the world lives. This relationship between giving and receiving is a healthy thing to think about personally, my motivations. And as I find myself in a place to advise or direct others, I think it's, especially at our age, in our positions in life, as we think about how we coach other people and lead other people, I think it's well to hold this very preciously, this idea of giving and receiving, what a person has been given and what a person then does with that. Jeff, you said it. So that is a bunny trail, but it's something I've been thinking about. Back to the text. You call me teacher and Lord, and you're correct, he says to his disciples. In verse 13, Jesus affirms the disciples' collective and current. He's into theology here. Their theological position in relation to their perception of Jesus. The disciples have it right in regard, at least to Jesus, into how they think about his person. So he complements that. But getting that piece correct is only part way. This too has been the emphasis in my Christian upbringing, getting it right in relation to how we think about Jesus. Big emphasis on, is Jesus God? And proofs in regard to that. That is a pinnacle focal point of many people of how I was brought up, of getting that right. But as Jesus is demonstrating right here, that's part of it, but it's only part way. what one does with this understanding, which is what actually matters. And Jeff, that goes back to your last statement, about giving and receiving, is that we are designed to give. But what happens first is, as you concur, is absolutely essential. It's what has always been true, demonstrated by God at the micro and macro level. And I'm a really stickler on that one. I think God has always demonstrated grace and giving. What we have done with that is reflective on our own condition. It's what is currently true through what Jesus has demonstrated at the micro level. Jesus is God in human flesh, we believe by faith. And as a result, he is representing what God is like within human flesh. And so the two correspond. And it's what you and I are invited into as his followers to participate at the practical day-to-day level. This type of service as demonstrated through the washing of the disciples' feet. So if the Lord, now he's moving on from that position, that affirmed theological position, he's moving forward with that idea. So if I, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Now, this is also, I think, really interesting. His use of the word so introduces his directive, a concluding, a movement towards his point. He's saying, this is what I just demonstrated is what you ought to do for each other. He uses the word ought. He uses the word ought. I generally don't like that word. I think ought is a destructive kind of word, but Jesus uses it, so I have to bow the knee to that. And ought, in this case, does exist. Jesus is saying there's an ought. And there is an ought, that we ought to do this. Followers of Jesus ought to do this, Jeff, just like you said.
Yeah, well, God also said that 10 times. With his 10 commandments, those are all oughts.
Yeah, those are oughts too. Yeah. So I gotta humble myself on those, but I'm not a fan of the word ought. I'll just say that. But the crux of the matter resides in personal intention. Here's the tension. Hey, Bill. Does my ought reside in my personal need to gain? See, I think that's part of that's part of the thing we learn as followers of Jesus, is to learn about personal intention. And if any of my ought resides in me looking or being better in order to gain some level of approval, that's unhealthy. Or rather, is my intention entirely for the benefit of you? This is what Jesus is demonstrating, entirely for you. And my place where I'm coming from is that only through an I am loved regardless perspective can one move from A to B. As I become settled in my understanding of how much I am loved by God Almighty, regardless of my performance, it frees me to move from A to B. And I think this is the path generally that every follower of Jesus grapples with for probably our entire lives. For I gave you an example, he says, that you also do just as I did for you. Jesus clearly labels his prior action as an example of what and how his followers ought to treat each other. Jesus uses that term example. To label something as an example is to attempt to clarify meaning directed to the recipient. And I think because of that, we need to pay attention. Therefore, it's only to our benefit to pay attention to the example that Jesus is self-proclaiming. And as any example, it's intended as a window into a much larger and broader application. Now, there are certain sectors of the church that practice foot washing. And I don't debate that, but I think it's only one minute, that's the example itself. But there is a much larger and broader application for us on a daily basis of what that foot washing is pointing to. And so to just stick with foot washing, I think there's value in going through that exercise and learning how to receive. I've actually had my feet washed before, and it is it's a moving experience because it's so outside the box of everyday life. But my guess is if I were to do that over and over again, it would become like rote, like a rote, and move towards less meaning. And if I attach my Christian service on that act, I'm really missing out. This is the example designed to get us to think at a much larger and broader application. His intended meaning of his example, concisely stated, and I took a stab at it, as my follower, this is what paraphrasing what I think he's saying, as my follower, first receive and then give for others. And now I've got a note. Jesus's consistent use of the word for. It's for the benefit of the other. It's quite possible to do an act of service to someone without doing it for that same someone. That would be that's my point there. That's really good to think about. Am I doing this to you or am I doing this for you? That's a good question for us all to ask. I've done a lot of things to people. Truly, here's the truly, moving to the point. Jesus says to you, said to the disciples, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. It's a supportive statement. He does a declarative statement, an example, and now a supportive example, tying it into their day-to-day experience. And he's saying, listen up. This means listen up. He's moving very, very strategically to a point. He appeals to their common and collective knowledge in regard to the master-servant relationship. In their minds, from their common experience and their observations, what he is saying is this makes perfect sense. This is, they would know what he's saying. He uses the word greater 2 times because in their minds, I'm getting into the motivation of why he's going into such detail with his disciples. Knowing that something is in their minds at the Last Supper, they don't know what's going to happen. Judas thinks he knows, but they know, I want to believe they all think whatever this 3 years was about is about to happen. and there is a what next. What next for them personally takes precedence in their thinking. I don't think these guys, if they're human like us, they're not thinking of the big picture. They're thinking about how is this next something going to affect me? And that is human nature. Whenever we're in a discussion, it's in our minds go micro into how is this discussion going to affect me? And I call it what about me thinking is always present in all human interactions. So that's why the emphasis. And then finally, the point. If you know these things that he just demonstrated and talked about and discussed, he says, you are blessed if you do them. If you do them. The punch now arrives. What is so ironic is that as one becomes free of me in order to be free to give for others, the blessing actually returns to me. This is what's so wild. We don't give to receive, but as we give, we receive. Blessing is designed to come from the outside of our power and to be freely given to its recipient. It's not within our scope to define what this will look like, nor are we to manipulate in any way to force outcome. We simply act and then embrace as blessing what comes our way. That is a by faith way of living. As Jesus stated elsewhere, and I think it's a correlation, the grain of wheat must die. And that means free of personal intention, that death, free of self. But if and when this occurs, there's always a harvest. Through a death, there is always a harvest. So as we look at this, we've got about 15 minutes. We've examined the idea that one must learn to receive before one can give entirely free from self need to gain. That's the basic idea, although there are caveats to that. In addition, we examined Jesus's directive to follow what he has demonstrated in verse 13, 1 through 11. He says, you ought to do this to other people. We have all been in discussions regarding the importance to know one's intentions. We have all worked through the ramifications of doing an act of service from an ill-placed motive. You guys, we are all well aware of that subject. However, before we move from this idea, let's dwell on the subtleties underlying why we Christian people serve. For me, okay, then I make a statement. As I look back, I have identified much of my Christian service as self-fueled as I look back. However, during the time, I would never have thought of it in this regard, but rather motivated by such things as duty, gratitude, obligation, and dedication. Some of those, actually all of those can be casted in very good motivations. My duty as a Christian. I'm grateful for what Jesus did on the cross for me. I'm obliged to, obligated to give my life to others because he has given his life for me. I'm a dedicated Christian, not an undedicated Christian. It appears as very religious, very sanctified, but there's another aspect to that. and I'm learning about that aspect. And I see the example of Jesus on what he did with the disciples as graphic representation of what it should look like. So let's talk about, we've got 15 minutes. What are your thoughts about you? Have you guys, to what degree have you guys thought about this idea of Christian service? The what now? We've all been on the journey for quite some time. And how are we to express that to the world? And what does that look like? What motivates you and I? So there's a lot of knowledge here, like, I don't know how many years, but lots of hundreds of years of knowledge and wisdom. So let's hear it. What are your thoughts?
I've always thought it odd that within the Christian culture, a giver is looked upon as someone who's an honorable disciple, and that a taker is almost a pejorative. This person's a taker, and Vince is a giver. But it's a dance. There is no giving unless somebody's receiving. And we know that just from a practical lifestyle of birthdays and Christmas and anniversaries and stuff. If you want to express your love for somebody by giving them something, and they blow it off and say, "Nah, I don't need that. Let's take it back." You've halted the blessing midstream. Somebody has to receive. If you're going to get the blessing of giving, somebody's going to have to receive. But I think we're wrongly taught that receiving, as a culture, a Christian culture, that receiving is the wrong end of the equation. But in practice, there can be no other way to give unless somebody receives.
Yeah.
So life should have taught us that to not receive is wrong, right there.
Right. Yeah, because it has to happen.
It has to happen. It's the end. If in case of emergency, this mask is going to drop out of the plane. No, you take it. You take it first. No, that's not how it works. You take it first, and then you'll have to give. But it's a strange coloring that we as a culture have put on the act of receiving, and really act of receiving is just as much a blessing. I get you can go overboard. You could shove your foot at Jesus' face and say, "Wash this for me." You can lose your mind. But I think it's tipped too far the other way.
Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, and my thought was, and I agree completely with what Vince just said. In verse 15, he says, "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Well, what did Jesus do initially? He humbled himself. He was God and creator of the universe. He took off his clothes. He got on his knees. He humbled himself and washed feet of his own creation. So his first act that we are to follow is humility, is humbleness. And the only way for me to give to somebody and to receive with gratitude, like Vince was saying, is to first humble myself. It is to realize how unworthy I am of receiving, but then to be able to give to others without any kind of I'm gonna get a blessing if I give to somebody. There's that for me. I fight that selfishness in giving. You know what I'm saying? I do this because, you know, like you were saying, out of gratitude, duty, obligation, dedication. But there's that underlying, I'm doing this so I can get a blessing too. But if I can give out of humility, out of humbleness, then that's when the blessing that I receive becomes all that it can be. If I taint the blessing, if I give out of a sense of pride, out of a sense of these things you were talking about here, then I miss the blessing that I would get. But if I start with what Jesus did and I humble myself, then any giving that I do becomes an untainted blessing for me from God.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Other thoughts? Yeah, I'd love to hear. Yeah, Bill, yeah, you got something.
I'm sorry, I just appeared this gale blowing and the boats were about to knock the dock over, so I had to go relocate them.
Yeah, we saw the background of the moving trees. We thought, hey, it looks like windy where it's built.
I think there's a cause and effect thing here, and I'm trying to think of a parallel, and the best I could come up with was years ago, Ellen and I got on this MRC, which is a low carb diet, and it worked. We lost a lot of weight, you know, and when I was skiing that winter, my skiing just improved radically. And so if someone said, Bill, if you take this diet, you ought to see improvement in your skiing. It's not like I have to improve it. This is a result of doing something. The result is this happens. So when Jesus says you ought to do this, I'm not sure if that's a command or if that's a statement of a result that's going to happen. You'll see this happen. And so my thinking is the cause and effect here is Jesus said, I've set an example for you. Pay attention to this example. If you pay attention to my example, what will flow out of it is you ought to be doing the same thing for your brothers.
Yeah.
So it's not like you ought to, it's not a should command. It's a watch this happen command.
That's a really, let me just interject a thought. My thinking has become more and more like that, what you just stated. I used to look at commands, the ought, as a command in order the ramification, or the reason I should do that is because it makes God happy. I no longer think of it in those terms. I think of it in terms of you should do that. You ought to do this because this is the way it is. This is just the way it is. And I'm giving you some pretty good advice here. If you know, it's not about pleasing anybody. It's about what actually exists.
Every time I hear the word ought, I think of that thing in James about blessings and cursings coming out of the same mouth. And he goes, these things ought not so to be. And I always have to stop and like diagram that sentence and like, is he for it or against it? You know?
Oh, yeah.
But it's sort of like
I think he says the odds. I think the odds are going to surprise. I think he means the odds are going to surprise you. You ought to do this. Watch this happen. Follow me and watch what happens. You know, not follow me and here's another command. Follow me and pay attention to the result.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Most of you are aware that Betty and I try to spend as much time as practical up at our cabin, which several years ago we named Blessing, and we based it on the old Hebrew root of the word barakah, which simply translated is blessing, but the connotation of it is when you are trying to be in a right relationship with the Father, and you honor him and you thank him and you praise him, what happens is he, if you will, turns around, although he's never turned away, but he returns those things right back to you, and it becomes a continual circle of blessing up to him and back down to us, up to him and back down to us. And all of the environments of that place for us have come to exemplify that kind of blessing. And the reason I raise this in this discussion, I guess, is because it gets to the essence of who he is, and it's the kind of relationship at the core that he wants to have with his children. If we understand who we are in him, then we can bless him for all the things that he provides for us and does for us from the very making of us on down the road. But the joy and the wonder and the mystery of it is that he just continues to shower those on us. And that's an amazing relationship to have. That is the essence of a truly loving father.
Yeah, I think that depicts who God is by very nature. Jesus called that blessing, that movement that you're talking about, as living water. Living water to Jesus is moving water, water that is actually physically moving. And so there's a cyclical type of, out of his bellies will flow rivers of living water. Same idea. It's a circular, what goes around comes around.
I've got to go, guys. Good to be with you. See you next. Well, I won't see you next week. We'll be at Blessing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll be here next week. We'll miss you. Have a good couple weeks. Yeah. We got room. It's usually John kind of pipes up at this time, but you know what?
I've just been
We got a little
soaking
bit
it all.
here.
I'm just soaking it all in. Yeah,
Okay.
how hard it is to receive, right? And I love the circular idea, right? What comes around goes around. So when there's a Marge Snyder was a folk singer in the 60s, 70s. And she had a lyric, when we cease to give, we cease to have. This is the law of love.
Oh, that's a lyric.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
So
That's good.
it's the idea of receiving, and then you can give, and then when you give, you get more back, and you receive, and it just kind of comes around, goes around. But I guess I feel more like Peter, right? Jesus comes around to you, and Peter goes, no, not me, right?
Yeah, I'm not worthy.
No, you're the Lord. I'm right. Don't do mine. I'm actually okay. Go to the next guy.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yes, Mike, I like that. I forgot about that idea of out of your belly, because my understanding is, and I gotta be careful, but there's a lot of metaphors since when they use the word gut, that's what they use for compassion. Compassion is your gut, is your belly. It's something that's deep inside of you, it flows out. So maybe out of your compassion, this stuff just naturally happens, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Splachna,
Yeah.
a great Greek word.
Belly is Blachna,
Yeah, splachna.
which, well, you hit the Greek there. What is that? It's
Well,
gotta
what,
be the
what
depth of
Bill
our,
said is it's bowels of compassion. It's not
Oh.
an anatomical item. It's a
right.
metaphor.
Could it be, say, the depth of our being, from the very core and depth of our being?
What's your gut tell you? You know, that's how he's used. What's your
Right.
gut tell you? You know.
Yeah.
We used to tell people that if you think of an analogy of like gathering firewood, you can go out and gather it yourself and you'll be able to pick up a few. But if you let somebody load you up, you'll get a whole lot more.
Yeah.
And so the idea of receiving, you get more blessed by receiving many times than if you say, I'll just do it on my own.
Yeah.
You don't get quite as much, firewood if you extend that analogy.
Oh, but Vince, it's more blessed to give than receive.
That's true too.
I know.
That road
These
like
verses
we're
just
tied up
collide
to
with
both.
each other.
It's an analogy. It's not an identity.
It's an example.
There are points of this.
Well, guys, great discussion this morning. And it's, we're not out to resolve anything. We're out to think about it. And I think that in itself is a healthy move. I'll be here I'll be here next week. I'll be here for about 3 weeks, so, which is great. I'm ready for a break, but anyway, I'll see you guys next week. Have a good week, and we'll see you again. Thanks for joining, Bill.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Good seeing you, Bill.
Thank you. We'll see you back home in 3 weeks.
Yeah, look forward to it.
All right.